Welcome to today's Lunchbox Talk. I'm Damon Waite, Director of the North Carolina Botanical Garden. And we're really excited to bring to you today author Georgianne Eubanks, who will be speaking about her new book, Saving the Wild South. Georgianne Eubanks is a writer, Emmy-winning documentarian, and popular speaker. She is the author of the 3-volume North Carolina Literary Trail series of guidebooks commissioned by the North Carolina Arts Council and published by UNC Press. She has also published in many magazines and journals, including Southern Cultures, South Writ Large, Our State, and Oxford American. Her last book from UNC Press, The Month of Their Ripening, North Carolina Heritage Foods Through the Year, was recently reissued in paperback. In addition to her work with many nonprofit organizations in the state, Georgianne is the executive director of the Paul Green Foundation. And if you come to the garden, you can see the Paul Green cabin. So Georgianne's going to be talking to us about her book, Saving the Wild South. Please join me in welcoming Georgianne to the garden.
Thanks, Damon. Now I have to have enough sense to follow the directions. Let's see. So these two quotes speak to kind of the mission of this book, is partly grounded in memory. For me, I believe that when we're children is when we can be most captivated by nature, and sometimes that connection can be lost. I think it has been more so in recent years because of digital world. But Carolyn Finney's comment about memory being a way to get people involved in preservation, conservation, and participation, I think is really important. I acknowledge that some of us don't have a great memory of nature. I think of African-American communities in Alabama where lynchings took place in the woods and there was great violence done to people. So it's not universal, our romantic love for nature, but I do think it is a way to get people involved in this process of conservation. And I've tried to write this book from an amateur's point of view. I'm not a botanist. I'm not moving somehow here. Sorry, David. Okay, so
And arrows, yep, there.
okay, there we are. Okay. So as I was saying, I'm not a botanist, but I wanted to follow my curiosity about plants. And when I was working on the last book on North Carolina foods, I discovered some plants that were endangered, and it alarmed me. And I thought, it would be really interesting because I was writing in that book about how food gives us identity as Southerners. And I thought it would be really interesting to look at how the natural world of plants creates part of our identity as Southerners and our culture. When we lose a plant or a piece of nature, we lose a part of our identity. It's pretty simple. But it was shocking to me to read E.O. Wilson, the Harvard scientist, saying that flowering plants come in with about 270,000 species known and as many as 80,000 awaiting discovery. So scientists who are working on biodiversity are in a race to find as many of the surviving species as possible, even before they vanish and thus are not only overlooked, but unknown, which was shocking to me. I mentioned that some of us have lost touch with nature. I think young people, of course, Richard Louv wrote that book a few years ago about children who had sort of missed the natural experience. Now there are a couple of botanists in the South who have used the term plant blindness to talk about how people in developed nations tend to can see plants as just sort of this green backdrop and can't distinguish among plants. People like Alan Weekly, who's here today, can tell so many little details about plants. I'm befuddled. I thought I knew how to distinguish between plants, but for some people, it's a blurry backdrop, and all they pay attention to are human-made objects or animals in their visual field. And these botanists checked out their findings by doing a survey in 2006 of high school students graduating. And they found that 77% of those they questioned had never grown a plant by themselves. Wow, that would not have been a possibility for me growing up with a bunch of gardeners. 10% had never picked fruit from a tree, and they couldn't remember a children's story that featured a plant. So this plant blindness that younger people mostly are suffering from has led to a decline in funding for plant conservation and for the study of botany itself. I did a consulting job a few years ago talking to botanical garden directors who all said they were worried about the future of botany because departments are in decline at many universities, or they're being combined under big umbrellas and kind of getting lost, and not just in the United States. So Donna Campbell, who's here today, raise your hand, Donna, she photographed this trek, and we sought out plants. Not all of them are on the endangered list because that's not the only measure, but all of them are rare. And they had good stories, which is why I picked the 12 plants I picked. But the people we met across 6 states who are working to save these plants are really, to me, what made the book so interesting. And today I want to talk about 2 plants that are represented here in the North Carolina Botanical Garden, and a third that, thanks to Alan Weekly, got me going on this journey to begin with. So here's the distribution of the botanical hotspots that we visited for the book across the 6 states. Each tells an important story about habitat and the kinds of vulnerability that these plants are subjected to. So you kind of get a sense of the spread here of where we traveled. It was a lot of fun, actually. The first plant I want to talk about is Michaux's sumac, and it was discovered in 1895. It's a plant that thrives by natural fires. In other words, when the lightning strikes and the prairie burns, this plant has an advantage in that situation. There's a specimen here at the gardens, as I mentioned, but we went to Georgia to see it in the wild. And Georgia ranks 6th in the nation for plant diversity. I grew up in Georgia. And there, the sumac had dwindled to 2 populations. One group of female plants that were living under a water tower in Newton, Georgia, which is kind of down in the south part of the state, and another population about 80 miles northeast, where 5 male plants were surviving on a bluff overlooking the Broad River near Elberton, Georgia, which used to be famous for peaches. So it was a critical situation a few years ago. The species had been in decline for 100 years. And again, Native Americans knew how to burn the landscape to get the most out of plants and to draw animals to food. And we now don't do that. In fact, in Florida, there was a place that really needed burning, and they were afraid the smoke would cross a major interstate and cause accidents. And so they don't burn anymore and forget the plants. But by the 1990s, half of all the historic occurrences of Michaux's sumac were gone, largely due to habitat conversion to agricultural and other uses. And this is the Broad River down there, and this is where we hiked to see the site of those last 5 male Michaux's sumacs. You can see the 2 populations were really quite, as the botanists say, disjunct. They're far away. Panola Mountain, which is marked here on the map, is the site of that a group of organizations is outplanting sumac because they believe it will do well there. So in 1993, a large, prolifically fruiting population was also discovered on U.S. Army lands in Virginia. See the red dot up at the far corner. Practice bombing causes fire and is an advantage to the plants. So the Army is now protecting these plants at the fort in Virginia. But the male and female plants have to be in proximity for pollination. So you can see the issue in Georgia. And so these guys, Mincy Moffett and his pal Morgan Betcher, have been key to saving the Michaux's sumac in Georgia. Mincy Moffett is a biologist who, when we first met, was working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or who's now working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he used to be with the Department of Natural Resources in Georgia. And Morgan Betcher in the blue shirt was a UNC student who moved to Georgia to go to grad school, did a year of grad school, got discouraged by all the bad news about the environment, and just decided to get busy working in the field, first in water quality and now working as a technician. So as a young man, Mincy, who grew up in Atlanta, we had a lot to talk about in the truck because I grew up in Atlanta about the same time. He majored in economics as an undergraduate at the University of the South in Sewanee. And then he got an MBA. And then he went to work for a bank in Atlanta. And he said, I had a career that I hated and 2 degrees that I didn't want to use anymore. So I thought, man, I've got to make a change. So Mincy left Atlanta in 1987 and went to live with his brother in Washington, D.C. There he got a job with Greenpeace, the activist organization, and he became the organization's administrative director. And then he started volunteering for nonviolent protest actions. Mincy had learned how to rock climb when he was a high school student. And so in 1989, in the midst of all the findings about the destructive impact of chlorofluorocarbon CFCs on the Earth's ozone layer, he concocted this plan to hang a huge banner from DuPont's water tower along Interstate 95 where everybody could see it. And the banner noted DuPont's status as a destructive force and the world's #1 producer of CFCs under the brand name Freon, which I'm sure you remember. So they scaled the 180-foot tower, they hung the 65-foot tall banner, and they camped for 3 days on top in protest. You can see, I think that's a figure up there on top. And television reporters would fly in, Mincy said, in their helicopters, news helicopters, and yelled their interview questions. And Mincy, this was back when the telephones were like, a big box, right? Like a cracker box, and he'd be talking to reporters. So that was pretty much fun, and he was hooked on this plant business. Then in 95, he and a couple of other guys posed as elevator repairmen and went up to the roof of the building next door to the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And they hopped across the roof of the bank to the roof of the bank. So they literally jumped across that gap. And they used the window washing arms on the building to drop this banner calling out the World Bank for their support of corporations that were involved in deforestation and river impoundments and the forced migration of indigenous people from their native lands. Now, Mincy, this was the anniversary of the World Bank. And so all the employees were standing near the window celebrating when this thing dropped right in front of them. And of course, he said, if we had done this after 9/11, we would have been shot. But this was 7 years before 9/11, but it was very close to the White House. So now the most dangerous thing Mincy does is he makes fire in the woods. And he earned a PhD at Auburn. He joined the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And as I mentioned, he's now with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Here he is near the Broad River, near that picture I showed you, doing a controlled burn to benefit the Michaux sumac and the Georgia aster, which also benefits from fire. The first time DNR burned the area where those 5 pitiful male sumac they increased the population to 25. So they thought, okay, this is good. This is Nick Holbrooks, who Mincy took us to meet, and he works in the Wildlife and Fisheries program. He's did a degree in biology at Clemson, and he now serves the DNR and is area manager for preserves across 4 counties in Georgia. He knows how to burn things, and he's also called in a lot of times to rescue wildlife in the region. And right next to him is a pine tree that's been girdled or cut around and burned. You can see the evidence, a very arty kind of picture, but this tree will eventually topple. But until it does, has stopped growing, and the woodpeckers and other animals can make use of the pine. So this is what they did with some trees to open up the canopy for the Michaux sumac. So Nick explained that we'd be hiking into this preserve along a fire break to the bluff where we would see the 5 poor, well, actually there were more by the time we got there. And so we hiked up this road, and Mincy and Nick were trading stories about how interesting it had been all these years to come into a wooded place where people are hunting and doing other illicit activities. That hunting was legal, but they would sort of flush them out with the fire. And they've also discovered some makeshift labs and liquor stills over time, and expect to find more. So Mincy showed us this sample of the sumac coming up. And this was, I think it was February, wasn't it, Donna? It was cold weather. And so there it is without leaves. And then you can see what the sumac looks like when it is in full flower. So I said, so what's the big deal, Mincy? Why should we care about Michaux sumac? And he said, well, other than the fact that it's a small deciduous shrub providing browse for some animals, it doesn't have a great story that's tied to a pollinator or some other juicy natural history. But Mincy said, I'm attracted to it because of its rarity and its cute little fuzzy limbs. He said it can survive a long time underground, as we have learned. And so can a lot of these endangered plants. So again, there are plants underground that are in bad places, but they may still be there. He said, I believe in the intrinsic value of biodiversity. We have to value these genetic resources that have fought their way across millennia to survive. And he said, my work is not just about plants that have some obvious value to humans. Our ecosystems are intricate webs, and we keep pulling strands out of the web, and eventually the whole web will collapse if we let that happen. So Mincy then, with the sumac, decided to bring his marketing and communication skills from Greenpeace to bear on the situation of sumac. He wanted people in Georgia to know about this plant. And so he used Valentine's Day to launch his scheme. And what he and folks from the State Botanical Garden of Georgia did was go dig up those female plants under the water tower and bring some of them up to the site we were at and put them together and hope that they would cross-pollinate. And he advertised this on Valentine's Day, which you can imagine the media, especially jaded media, who are always looking for that Valentine's Day story. It was in newspapers, it was on the radio. It was a great scheme to get publicity for Michaux sumac in Georgia. So here's a lady plant, I guess. I don't know, it's got pink on it. But after 2 more prescribed burns in 2018, and after we visited in 2020, Mincy and his colleagues counted more than 1,500 stems on that bluff. So the male and female patches have grown together and are not really possible to distinguish among them. There's so many, which is really great. This is Pondra Williams from Beach Hollow Farm. And the next day, after we'd been to the bluff, we met Mincy and Morgan at this farm, which is commercial. They sell, it's a nursery operation, and they perform occasional contract work for the Department of Natural Resources and a lot of volunteer hours to assist the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance, which is this gold standard group of a bunch of nonprofits and corporations and others who are concerned about plants, and they work in coalition to create these safeguarding projects. So that day, the team was planting sumac that had been taken from the bluff to the Atlanta Botanical Garden, grown to a certain size. And again, they have a Gainesville facility that's not the downtown show place, but a place where they grow plants. They brought these plants up from Gainesville and that had been rooted, and they were going to plant them on Pondra's land and try to study sort of what the viability of different techniques are to be successful in a controlled setting. So it's a sort of part of the restoration process. That's Morgan and Claire Isley, who you'll meet in a minute, but Morgan said something, and the young people that we met were part of the real inspiration of this project. But he said, you know, it's not so good to start caring about something when it becomes rare, which is really true. And Claire Isley was interesting. She grew up in San Diego and then joined the Air Force for 7.5 years, and then started her horticultural career working on organic farms and ended up in Georgia, and was just really a great person to meet and is going to devote her life to this kind of work. She prefers to work without gloves so that she can be more in touch with her planting projects, part of the optimistic story. So there's the gang. We said goodbye to them. There's Donna with her camera, and left with a real sense of optimism that projects can work of this sort and make a difference. Is Michaux sumac present in North Carolina? Yes, it is. Alan could probably tell us some spots, but it's fully protected at Fort Bragg, which is, again, another Army base, the world's largest. And they actually have an endangered species branch of employees who work, botanists who work on the plants that are rare and endangered on the base. And of course, they burn the forest. If you've ever driven to Fayetteville, you drive through that corridor and see the charred trees. They have Venus flytrap and American chaffseed, which is another chapter in my book, and a rough-leafed loosestrife, and 28 of the 56 populations of the loosestrife in the entire world are at Fort Bragg. And they also protect butterflies and the red cockaded woodpecker. So that's something to feel good about Fort Bragg. So now we turn to the Miccosukee gooseberry, which was one of those plants that sounded so interesting, but I wasn't sure if it would be a good story, but it turned out to be an excellent story. And it is also represented here at the Botanical Gardens. Probably the most remarkable thing about this plant is that it survives at all. It's deciduous, perennial shrub. It can grow to 3 to 4 feet tall. It's a member of the currant family, and it's globally classified as critically imperiled. There are 2 populations in the South, scattered private lands in Florida, which makes them more endangered, and public lands in South Carolina. How in the world did these 2 populations survive, and why? And how, what is the native territory? So it's one of the rarest plants in North America. It's also really pretty, and it's got thorns, so you got to be careful. It sheds its leaves in the summer, and then they begin to grow back in the fall, and then in the spring, these delicate pendant flowers emerge. And this is the lone specimen at Duke Gardens on this side, and that's a close-up from these, the specimens here. It's really quite an interesting plant. So both of these sites, the one in Florida and the one in South Carolina, have similar characteristics. They're highly acidic soil. They stay moderately wet. But all the other gooseberries in the ribes family are like red currants and black currants, grow at much higher elevations and farther north. So until this plant was discovered in Florida, the only gooseberry in the South had been found by a botanist named John K. Small, who you will hear more about, on Stone Mountain in Georgia. And so it's called the granite gooseberry. So these 2 guys, Hardy Kroom and Alvin Wentworth Chapman, were a couple of Florida botanists in the 1800s who never found the gooseberry, which was interesting to me. Hardy Kroom was from North Carolina. He was a slave owner. He was a plantation guy who grew tobacco, and a one-time state senator who inherited 2,400 acres from his father, he and his brother. And he came to Florida and started exploring and became quite the botanist. He discovered the Florida Torreya tree, which is another chapter in my book, but he never found the gooseberry. He was friends with Alvin Wentworth Chapman, who was a physician who would go, and there were several physicians in history who would travel, and preachers too, who would travel by horseback and botanize on their way between destinations. And he was one of those guys. So he would go do a house call to a patient and he'd look at plants on the way. He said his horse was really a better botanist than he was. So he came within striking distance of the gooseberry, but he didn't find it. He did find a wild Florida azalea in the Apalachicola area where he ended up living and dying, which was really amazing. But it was Roland Harper and Dr. Herman Kurtz who finally found the gooseberry in 1924. So Harper was this really eccentric guy who hated cars, but he would take notes on the window of trains that he rode in, and he would look out the window of the train and make notes when he saw something, and then get off the train and walk back on the tracks to go get his specimens out of the forest. He wore out a bunch of shoes. He was really kind of wacky. But he walked all over the South, Alabama and Georgia and North Florida. And he was also the first botanist of his area to understand that and advocate for the importance of fire to our longleaf forests. And he was mostly dismissed by his peers for that idea. But on an afternoon in February of 1924, he convinced Herman Kurtz to drive his car, so they didn't have to walk, to go out to Lake Miccosukee, which was farther than Harper could walk in a day, but not that far from Tallahassee. And Kurtz was on the faculty at Florida State, which was then called the Florida College for Women. And so they drove to the northeast side of Lake Miccosukee, named for the Indian tribe that used to be there. And neither had ever been there before. They entered the woods. This is a picture Donna took near the lakeshore, and started taking inventory of the luxuriance of the vegetation and the predominance of deciduous trees. Harper wrote, "If it were not for the presence of the Spanish moss, anyone entering this forest in twilight could easily imagine himself to be somewhere in Ohio or Kentucky. I was surprised to see a few specimens of a currant or gooseberry," he noted. And so they agreed they'd come back again and see what this gooseberry would do. Well, as luck would have it, Roland Harper figured out that the foremost authority on blueberries and currants was coming to Tallahassee at the end of the month. Frederick Vernon Coville, who doesn't really look much like some of these botanists, was the chief botanist for the Department of Agriculture and founder of the National Arboretum and honorary curator of the National Herbarium. And they took him to see the plants. He got really excited about finding a currant this far south because the southern location was far enough away from this rust disease that plagued currants in the north that he thought, oh, maybe this is a new agricultural possibility. So Kurtz and Coville visited Lake Miccosukee again at the end of March. And then on April 22nd, Harper said, he wrote that he conducted Dr. John K. Small, the guy I mentioned before, and his party to the spot. And they found the fruit about 2/3 grown. So they still couldn't quite tell much about the berries. And John Small was from the New York Botanical Garden, and he just couldn't miss out on such a find because he was, by that time, deep into Florida botany. And so he photographed the gooseberry using this black backdrop to accentuate the plant's features. And I just say, we'll talk more about him in a little bit, but excuse me, I've got a little, well, you're not seeing it. Okay. Oops. Okay. He started out in North Carolina when he was an undergraduate. He was going to school in Pennsylvania, and he and his buddy, Arthur Heller, came down to spend a summer in the Blue Ridge, which is the topic of chapter 1 in my book, and eventually ended up being the curator of the herbarium at the New York Botanical Garden. But he really got into Florida, and he traveled Florida in what he called his weed wagon, collecting samples. And he was very conversant with the Native American folks, and the Seminole Indians often would help him find plants, tell him about plants, take him deep into the swamps.
Battery died.
Oh, okay. Take him deep into the swamps and mangrove forests. And the Miccosukee Indian tribe was actually very connected to the Seminoles because they had started in Georgia and fought in the Seminole Wars and then moved eventually to Florida. And now the tribe, which is about 500 people, has a casino in Miami. Anyway, he was very distressed that these people were being displaced along with the plants and that we were losing so much wisdom from the native folks in Florida. And so by the 20s, of course, there were all these pathways being cut into the hammocks in Florida, and it gave small opportunities for discovery, but it also made him sad because the Wild South was not so wild anymore, especially in Florida. Today, the state of Florida has more endangered species of plants than any other in the South and ranks third in the nation behind Hawaii and California. So I have to show you this picture because it's just too funny. This is John Small in the bow of the boat taking a picture of his wife and 4 kids who are in a boat, probably in the Everglades, one with a machete, the other with a shotgun. They're plant hunting supposedly, but they are well armed in case of, I don't know what, alligators. But shows you a little bit of John Small's sense of humor. So Science Magazine got word of the gooseberry find from Coville, and they publicized or sent out a press release and published it. And this is what they wrote. The elevation of the humble gooseberry from its present position as a minor fruit, good only for pies and preserves, to the dignity of a table fruit on par with cherries, plums, and grapes is one of the possible results from the discovery of a new species in the woods of northern Florida, a region where gooseberries have never before been known. So Professor Kurtz's wife made some jelly of the unripe berries, and Harper said they tasted like apple jelly, but nothing special. Science went on to say, into this rather unpromising setting, the new Florida species comes almost like a horticultural fairy godmother. They finally admitted at the end of the press release, though, that there was one notable drawback. The berry is covered with so many long, sharp spines that it suggests a little porcupine. It is hoped that these can be eliminated in the breeding experiments now underway at the Department of Agriculture. I don't think they ever got into the breeding experiments. I talked to a guy who was a researcher at Tall Timbers in northern Florida, and he said he tasted them, and those spines have this sticky substance in them that are really not appetizing. So it was a flop. So you know what I mean about it's a miracle that this plant still exists. So we went to Lake Miccosukee, even though it's really not possible to get to the water without treading on some private land, but of course we did that very quickly. We parked at the top of a bluff and walked down and saw the water and saw the amazing cypress knees and had a feeling there might be some animals we didn't want to meet, but at least we got to the water. That was one site. There's a second site that's on private property that belongs to the family that owns Orvis, you know, the oldest mail order retailer in the United States. I didn't know that. And the land is only open to visitors when Orvis has a shooting school, and they have a kennel and dog training facility, but the Orvis family has committed to protect the gooseberries on their property. But the question is, why hasn't the range of plants expanded into the area where suitable habitat exists, both north and south of the present stands in Florida? Part of the answer might be Christmas berries, an invasive species, Ardisia crenata. It was growing in the clearing where we had gotten out in the first place to see the berry, to just look at Lake Miccosukee. So it was an Asian ornamental, first offered at a commercial nursery in Florida in 1886. And by the 1960s, it started appearing in natural areas of the state. Birds spread the seeds far and wide, and it's really hard to get rid of. So it was declared an invasive species in 95 and then upgraded to a noxious weed. And now it's illegal to sell or propagate in the state. But it is crowding the gooseberries. And then there is the cottonmouth, which Tall Timbers did a research project, set up a camera at night to try to figure out what was chewing up the berries on the existing Miccosukees. And this mouse was eating the seed to the point and spitting it out, but it couldn't possibly propagate. So that was a problem. But the person who's in charge of the recovery plan for the plant for the Forest Service, Vivian Negron Ortiz, says that's still not an answer of why it's not spreading. She said basically this is the St. Marks River nearby, by the way, which the Miccosukee Lake water runs underground into, and this goes into the ocean. They're gathering plants and seed materials, and probably will have to become preserving the materials, the genetic materials, the long-term seed bank storage and other measures may be needed. And of course, working out agreements with private landowners where the plant is part of it. But the verdict is not so encouraging for the Miccosukee gooseberry. We did, while we were at St. Mark's, go to see Gail Fishman of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's since retired, but we're staying in touch. She wrote this great book called Journeys Through Paradise, and it's all about the botanists who tromped around Florida in the 1800s. And so I said, you know, why do you think these two populations exist so far apart? And she said that, you know, maybe this one scientist said it's easy to propagate the seed if you try in the right place, but maybe the Cherokee and the Creek and the Miccosukee took the seeds from South Carolina and carried them to Florida. But she said, you know, trade went on between the tribes for a lot of years before Europeans ever got here. So we don't really know. Could have been birds, could have been anything, but we're left with these two odd patches of this plant. So finally, we get to the last plant very quickly, the Yadkin River goldenrod. And it was introduced to me by Alan Weekly at the beginning of this project. And I began my research with a conversation with him here at the garden. And he told me about John Kunkel Small, the guy who rode around in his weed wagon, who photographed the gooseberries. And he said he loved this journal that he had read, that Small had written when he had made his plant hunting visits to North Carolina in the 1880s. And toward the end of one of those trips, he came into the Yadkin River Valley, which is Stanley County, kind of north of Charlotte, and came upon a goldenrod, John Small did, that didn't look like anything he'd ever seen. He was pretty sure it was a unique species, and he gave it the name Solidago plumosa. And after that discovery in 1894, because it only was found in this very one place, like one place in August every year, kind of fell out of plant guides. But Weekly, who at that time in 1994 was the state botanist and ecologist in the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, he had been taking inventory around this area in Stanley County. And at the end of the day, he thought, well, I remember that John Small article about the goldenrod, and in one aerial photo, he saw some rocks, which was what what Small had said they grow on the rocks by the river. And so he was near the Narrows Dam, and he thought, you know, maybe the plant just got eaten up by Alcoa with all these dams they built on the Yadkin River and the hydroelectric generator and all that. But he still was in mind of this article that was published. And when I read the article, it became a whole chapter in the book because it was so entertaining what Small and Heller did when they were in the Blue Ridge and then came down the Yadkin to find this flower. So anyway, this is what Small wrote. In the latter part of August 1894, I was surprised to find handsome specimens growing in the crevices of the rocks at the bottom of the canyon at the falls of the Yadkin River and at the Narrows some miles above the falls in middle North Carolina. These plants differ from specimens in the northern localities. There is abundant growth during the last part of August and the first weeks of September, but at all other seasons, hardly a vestige of the species can be found. And so now on a humid August afternoon, exactly 100 years since Small saw the goldenrod for the second time, Alan Weekly and his team member drove down, scrambled through the bush, and there it was. Alan said, "I know my goldenrods." That day was one of my top 10, he said. So he found it. So John Small became, as I said, the first curator of museums at the New York Botanical Garden, and he collected thousands of samples in his lifetime. He single-handedly saved the wild Louisiana iris and discovered 90 different species of it. He kept coming up in my research, and so did Alan Weekly. So we'd seen Weekly at work. We decided to go see where Small worked. So we went to the New York Botanical Gardens. I'd call them and ask them if they had the samples, the herbarium samples of the Solidaga plumosa. And they said, they're somewhere in Canada now. And I said, well, we'll come anyway. I'd never been to the Botanical Garden in New York or herbarium at all. So we met Matthew Pace in the lobby, and I asked him if they might have the Miccosukee gooseberry samples. And he said, we'll see. So we went up into these rooms of cabinets that are full of sheaves of paper stacked for days. And Matthew started looking, and he found the Miccosukee gooseberries and brought them to the table. He'd found the folder. And, you know, if I hadn't done my own hiking and read about all these guys out in the woods, the snakes, the storms, the carrying the plants, I might not have been so excited, but my eyes welled up. I was so moved by seeing these samples. And there it is, that spiny Miccosukee gooseberry pressed from 1924. So there was the connection with Small, which must have been something like what Weekly felt at the Yadkin. And I just realized we owe so much to the botanists who discovered and named these native treasures of the South and are now working to save them. So thanks, Alan. That's my story. So we'll take questions now. These are the two books I mentioned, and I've got a few copies of if you're hungry, I've got copies of the food book. So I think they're going to have the books in the bookstore, but any questions?
I have to do a little spiel.
Okay.
Oh, never mind.
Cute questions. We have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah. Are there any questions in the room first?
Yes, ma'am.
You said you narrowed it down to 12. Was it really hard? And how did you decide on what to focus on?
Yeah. So how did I decide what to focus on? And did I, was it really hard to narrow it down to 12? There were a number of candidates. I wanted to be, I wanted diversity of threat, of geography, of people, if I could. So for example, there are a couple of plants that are especially Native American stories, and African American stories in here too. So I was trying to sort of get my arms around as big a picture as I could, and it fairly represent. Of course, some of the plants were in more than one state, and it's only 6 states. So I didn't do Virginia, I didn't do Mississippi. They're mad at me, but there's always another day. But it was yeah. There were 3,000 plants probably in the region, maybe more, that we could have picked from. I tried to not get overly in the weeds, so to speak,
All right. We have one from an online guest. You mentioned the Miccosukee gooseberry found on a private property in Florida. How did you come across that? Did the property owner alert you to it?
The people who are charged in the Forest Service with keeping an eye on this plant know where it is. And I dug deep enough to find out where it was, but I never really saw it because I wasn't going to invade their private property. But I'd seen it here and at Duke, so that felt like okay. I didn't want to lead people to these plants. I have another story about a lily in Alabama that people just started ripping it out of the rivers to try to plant it at home. And of course, this lily only grows where there's moving water and rocks. and so I didn't want to encourage people to vandalize, but it is possible to find that stuff online, actually. And then I followed up with people who knew about, several scientists who knew about it.
As a follow-up, could you speak about the role of citizen scientists in locating these endangered species?
Yeah, so the Florida Torreya chapter, which is it's an unusual yew tree in Florida that is in terrible danger. And there is a body of citizen scientists called the Torreya Keepers who have committed to, well, there are two groups actually, the Torreya Guardians and the Torreya Keepers. But there are citizen scientists who have private property adjacent to the state park where these trees remain, very few of them. They got wiped out by Hurricane Michael in a bad way. But they're allowing the Atlanta Botanical Garden to plant those seedlings on their private property and have committed to seeing those trees flourish, if possible, in the same environment, the only environment in the world where they grow. And so we went into the forest with a group of folks from the Atlanta Botanical Garden and these property owners who were actually two charming women, probably in their 80s, hiking up those steeps like crazy. And Donna and I were like, oh, you know, trying to keep up. But we met other folks who, you know, just like Pondra, who were giving their property to help preserve and encourage outplanting of species. And there are lots of opportunities to get involved, as I'm sure you know. There are days that you could volunteer here at the Botanical Gardens. There are places you could go and work for a day or two and help. So there are lots of opportunities.
Can home gardeners grow these endangered plants on their land to help save them or restore them?
Well, there are some legal ramifications. There is a black market, you know, on some of these, like the Alabama canebrake pitcher plant. There's a young man in Alabama, a great guy named Noah Yon, who monitors Facebook and eBay and other sites where these poached plants are sold for great sums and tries to intervene. But yes, I had somebody offer me some Oconee bells. I don't know, is that legal, Alan? Can I plant them on my yard?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, see, the deal is, if it's your property, you can do what you want. If it's public property, they protect the plants, which is a great irony because the Catawba Indian tribe in South Carolina wants to grow the Schweinitz sunflower, which is another chapter, and they want to grow it to harvest the roots because it's a traditional food source for the tribe, and nobody's tasted tuber from a sunflower in 200 years, but they can't harvest them on public land because they're endangered. So the tribe has to sneak the flowers and plant them on private land. It's kooky.
So is the fact that some plants exist exclusively on private property, is that what makes them more endangered, just because there's no way for others to, you know, access the species?
Yeah, so are they more endangered on private land? Yes, only if the owners are willing to protect them. And of course, people die and families take over and family property gets sold. That's Gail Fishman was the person in Florida was talking about how her generation had sold out family property and the plants go with them and the developments come in, and it's the family's sort of inheritance and financial security, but the land, once you sold it. So.
Any more questions in the room? I want to hear anyone from here and ask questions. A couple more from online users. Back to the Michaux sumac. Are there other species of sumac in North America? And are any of them endangered like the Michaux sumac?
There are a bunch of kinds of sumac, a whole bunch, and I don't know about other endangered ones.
I think all the other members of the genus I could think of are actually pretty common and widespread.
So Alan says most of the others are common, yeah, and widespread.
And the last question I'm seeing right now, Could you speak about any cooperation existing between botanical gardens in the South on trying to save and propagate these endangered plants?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, this is actually a very small community of people. And everybody I talked to pretty much knew everybody else I talked to across 6 states. And there are gatherings like the Southeastern Plant Conservation Group meets every other year, I think. And then there are state groups that include corporations, as I mentioned, and nonprofits, and people who have a vested interest in plant preservation for whatever reason, or just out of a moral and ethical commitment. And so they do all talk to each other, and they do stay in touch, and they share stories. And it was really kind of cool that everybody knew everybody. And it's worked great for book sales. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
George,
Damon.
and,
Thank you very much.